Okay, great, thank you. See if that feedback goes away in a second. Welcome. Thank you for coming out this morning. Sometime as the national airlines were causing me to circumvent the country that we all live in over the past day and a half to get here, started to wonder if this conference was all kind of a big joke and I was on some sort of TV show. But I see you here. I'm here. I got here at about 3 this morning. So if there's dishevelment and disarray in this talk, please forgive me. But what I want to talk to you about today really is why I'm so excited to be here and why I'm excited about the Computational Sustainability Network, the new NSF award, all of that and more. And that's really because I think that the thinking about sustainability challenges through the lens of computer science really is at the intersection of two of humanity's most important ages. So the first one for everyone sitting here is probably quite obvious, right? It's the information age, defined by the ubiquitous computing all around us that defines basically how we live our lives every day. But the second age that's of equal or greater importance is the Anthropocene, right? Defined by exponentially and accelerating negative impacts of human activities on Earth's natural systems. So first and foremost, I'm a conservation biologist. That's what all of my formal training is. I am motivated by this applied study, right, of perturbed species, communities, and ecosystems. That's why I went to school. That's why I get up and go to work every day. And if you haven't been paying attention, things are pretty perturbed out there, right? We can look at certain high-profile species like rhinos and the population loss that's occurring over the past few years, where we've had accelerating poaching problems. You can look just more generally at things like the Living Planet Index, where you can see that populations of a broad variety, a broad diversity of species across the world are declining. Things like the Iucn Red List will tell us similar. And it's not just species, it's ecosystems. We're losing something like 500 football fields a day of tropical forests, right? These are all stories and bits of information that you can pick out just out of the daily news cycle. Things have been so bad. And of course, it's not just forests, but things like coral bleaching going on with ocean acidification. So things seem to be kind of getting acceleratingly out of hand. And if the question you're asking yourself is, well, how bad are things relative to what they would be in the absence of humans? The answer is pretty bad. Current species extinction rates, if you measure them against what we'd expect the background rate to be, or the absence of humans, we're about 1,000 times higher than you would expect if we weren't around doing all the things that we do on planet Earth every day. But then after grad school, which is when I kind of finished my formal training in conservation biology, I took a different career path, I guess, for a conservation biologist. And I went and became a permanent research scientist at Microsoft Research, where I've been given the remit to lead a research program around the computational technologies behind how we monitor, model, and manage environmental systems. And I did that very consciously, and that's because conservation biology has always been an interdisciplinary endeavor, right? We've always known that we've had to have success to slow the loss of biodiversity and impacts on natural ecosystems, we'd have to somehow figure out how to combine traditional kind of mud on boots ecology, right, with the political acumen of a seasoned politician. And we've done that really well in some regards, particularly if you look at metrics like how well we've been able to get some of these concerns at high-level policy implementation and into international policy mechanisms, things like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the recently revised UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? But you don't have to look at these for very long to realize just how ambitious the goals that we've set for ourselves really are. I don't know, how many people actually have looked at the Sustainable Development Goals? All right, we all should look at the Sustainable Development Goals, because if you're at the Computational Sustainability Network Symposium, you should definitely know it, because these cover everything that are in the applied space that we're all talking about over the next few days. I'm particularly interested in 13, 14, and 15, right? Climate action, life below water, life on land. And, you know, we say grand things underneath here. We say, like, sustain all life on Earth, right? I mean, that's a big, big ambition. And so the problem is that when you start thinking about how we're going to achieve these lofty goals, it becomes really clear, really quickly, that the information gap between what we know and what we need to know is way too big, right? The scope with which we know it is way too narrow. The scale is way too small. The speed is way too slow. And more importantly, and I think what we all can contribute here, is that if we keep trying to increase the information that we have at our disposal using the traditional means, the cost is going to be way, way too high. So what do I mean by all of this? When I say the scope is too narrow, the scale is too small, and the gap's too big, well, let me know if anyone here knows the Iucn Red List. Okay, great. So a quarter of you. So the Iucn Red List is the global repository of information on species assessments around the world, right? So when you read the newspaper, this species is threatened with extinction or has gone extinct in the wild or something like that, that comes out of this global consortium of over 10,000 scientists working together to assess species one by one. And they've done a fantastic job. They've done about approaching 72,000 species have been comprehensively assessed for their conservation actions, and you can see that they get broken down into everything from critically endangered, extinct, all the way down to least concern. But there's a problem there, and that's because of the species that we know, we've only described 72,000, and we know that there's something like 1.5 million species out there. Those are species that we have collected and described scientifically, right? So that means just up front, the IUCN assessment is a tiny, tiny fraction of how many species we know there to be on Earth. But it gets even worse, right? Because we also know that we don't know most species on Earth. Right? So we've described about 1.5 million species. There's likely, these represent some of the best estimates, there's likely around 10 million species on Earth. So the fraction just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And even these estimates are wrong. I mean, I've published quite a few papers on these, and so I can tell you how wrong mine are. These aren't mine, but you know, I can definitely guarantee you that there's more than 1,300 species of bacteria in the oceans, right? So these are our best, you know, most widely accepted estimates, but they're still probably wildly insufficient. And what do I mean by the scope by which we know it? Well, everything that I've just been talking about is about species as a metric of biodiversity. But what about all the things that are species, the features of species, right? So things like body mass, body size, all of that. Well, we know even less about that. So most species have only been described from one specimen in one location, which makes it extremely hard for us to know the average body mass, the average fecundity, et cetera, et cetera. And we know that those distributions are changing as we describe more species. So my favorite example is you know, these orchids, a small subgroup of orchids called Pleurothalidae. So most orchids, as people know, because people like orchids for their large, showy flowers, that's what we think about orchids when we think about them, right? We made a movie adaptation and a book called The Orchid Thief and all sorts of things based on people's obsessions with orchids. But is that what orchids really are, right? Because since the year 2000, there was about 3,500 species of orchids, and since the year 2000, another 1,000 had been discovered, and they were all in this genus Pleurothalidae, which are tiny, non-showy little flowers, which completely change our understanding of what an orchid is. Or frogs, right? I choose to click on any time that Google shows me a news article about a new species being discovered, so my news feed is filled with stuff like that. And every frog that we're discovering is pretty much smaller than the mean from a body mass perspective, right? So we know we've only described about 1/3 of all species, and every species that we find is different from the mean in various ways of its distribution of diversity. So what we think biodiversity is, the domains of diversity, is completely different in reality than what we assume it to be. And the scale at which we know it, just because computers and computer models let us make beautiful maps like this showing the richness of species spread out at high resolution across continental scales, they can't hide the fact that underneath those data, or underneath those maps, are data at this scale, right? Which is a map of elephant distribution in Africa and elsewhere, right? Elephants don't occur everywhere, they occur in certain spots, so these data are super coarse. And let's talk about speed. Well, if there are about 10 million species and we continue going on at about 17,500 species a year being described, we're talking almost 500 years to describe all the species on Earth. Well, that's a bit of a problem, because if you take the 5% estimate of species going extinct every decade, that means that 50% are going to be extinct within 50 years, 92% are going to be extinct by catalog complete, and those of you who took your math, which is probably all way more than I did, can quickly realize that that comes into a bit of an intersection there where more species are going to be, where all species are going to be gone extinct before we can actually complete it. And same thing for 1% of, if you go down to 1% of species extinct every year. And the cost is going to be extremely high to do anything about this, right? So if you think about accelerating the rate at which we describe species, if we wanted to do that in the next 50 years, it's going to take about $1 billion a year. If we just wanted to improve the status of every bird on the Iucn Red List, so there's 10,000 birds about, if you want to improve the status of every one of those on the Iucn Red List just by one category, we're talking about something like $5 billion annually for 10 years. And if you want to protect birds into perpetuity, you're talking about $65 billion annually running cost. So that stuff's pretty crazy. And it's what got me, and I'm sure some of you thinking in this room quite a few years ago, that while probably not a silver bullet, there's got to be a role for technology in helping us increase the scope, scale, speed, and reduce the cost in what we know about Earth's biodiversity. And there's been some really big success here, right? This is an application called I-Naturalist, started by a good friend of mine and co-graduate student when we were studying, named Scott Laurie, and using extremely standard computational tools and techniques, they're able to build some citizen science applications that in the few years they've been running have over 1.5 million observations, but I think more importantly have been able to provide a platform that empowers other organizations to pursue their missions, like a partnership between National Geographic Society and the National Park Service to do bio-blitzes in all of the national parks around the United States this year. I mean, eBird was, started here at Cornell, was one of the early and still the biggest player in this space, showing by concentrating on one taxa how you really can combine experts, non-experts, and machines together to wildly increase the amount of information that we know about certain species. I don't know if Steve's here, but I think I'm right in saying that the last time I checked, more information was going into the Global Biodiversity Informatics Facility from eBird than all other data sources combined, right? So it's been a big deal, and it's not just, software and services. We've also got hardware out there in the field, companies like Conservation Metrics doing passive acoustic monitoring, combining field deployed microphones, GPU-based deep learning to do species recognition from sound. And other things like GPS have gotten to a point where we can combine them with social media and have sharks check in at beaches in Australia, right, to warn swimmers that they're around. So right on cue, of course, the media have come in and started to overhype this a little bit, I think, in my opinion, right? Because they want to talk about the ways that artificial intelligence or technology in general will save the day. And in many ways, that's great. That's a shared vision that I have as well, using computational tools and techniques to help us keep our finger on the pulse of the natural world. But the problem is those examples that I've shown and a bunch that I didn't mention notwithstanding, as this headline shows, the information age still is pretty much failing the world's wildlife. And I like to blame that in large part on the narcissism that we, the narcissistic way that we deploy and invent technologies, right? It's always about us. And that's fine if you want to be able to, have 2 speakers on your lapel or take selfies all the time. But we've gotten to a point now where I don't think it would be super surprising to anyone in this audience to find out that there might be companies out there that know more about individuals here than we as a species know about the rest of life on Earth, right? And that is a sad state of affairs, in my opinion. So if it were just possible to take what we've built for people and directly translate it efficiently and cost effectively into other domains, then we'd be set, right? And we could be narcissistic and still be helpful at the same time. But there's a great article in The Atlantic recently, The Perils of Using Technology to Solve Other People's Problems, that really kind of sums up how difficult this really can be. And in my mind, a lot of that has to do with a resource problem, right? Large companies like the one I work for are busy kind of hoovering up all the top talent. As any computer science faculty in the room can tell you, it's extremely difficult to keep people in academia these days, much less out in the field working for even less money for a conservation NGO using these skills. And we need top talent oftentimes because using consumer level technology in the field to monitor biodiversity quickly raises a lot of really hard challenges. So, the classic manufacturing trilemma of cheap, light, and strong, pick 2, really applies, only there's more dimensions as well. We often need them to be cost efficient, light, strong, power efficient, have connectivity strategies, and more. And so while it's definitely possible to buy consumer level technology and start trying to use it out there in the field, oftentimes what happens is, the drone breaks and there's nobody there to fix it. The algorithm's got a bug and the intern went back to school, right? The camera traps are out there, they're collecting data, but now we've got 2 billion pictures that we have to sort through all the time. Yeah, Tanya's in the back working on a problem just like that. So there's a couple different ways that you can think about solving this resource problem. And some colleagues and I about 5 years ago went at it in one way, which was trying to set up an online community of conservation practitioners, field scientists, and technology professionals to come together and share best practice, help people understand and learn about the solutions that they'd deployed. And since that time, this approach has really kind of taken off. There's been a ton of activity. And really, if you're wondering where I'm going with all of this, this is kind of the only reason I'm here, which is to, if you don't know about a lot of the activities in this space, to help you get to know it. So there's all sorts of things, right? There's a huge consortium of conservation NGOs that have come together under royal funding in the UK called United for Wildlife. There's a new platform out there as part of that called wildlabs.net, which has taken what we've tried to do with Technology for Nature and just made it much bigger and better. There's, if anybody reads mangabay.com, one of the top online news sources for environment and conservation science, they just launched an entire section of the website devoted to conservation technology. They're always looking for new stories, byline writers, things like that. There's programs out there, Biodiversity and Wilderness Solutions Program at Resolve. They just did a global survey looking at what the needs are within the domain. The Wildlife Crime Tech Challenge just happened, sponsored by the USAID. Conservation X Labs is a new NGO devoted entirely to this, as is Conservify. The Society for Conservation for Biology just launched a new working group on conservation technology. And of course, there's the kind of the original thing out there, Technology for Nature, which is being taken up within academic units, and I can, as a student chapter run sort of thing, and I can put you in touch with people doing that. And so, like I said, that's kind of why I'm here. I'm just interested in getting to know all of you and trying to see how we can figure out where the Institute for Computational Sustainability and Computational Sustainability Network can find the right intersection point between applied conservation problems, hard computer science, and stable and robust partnerships for implementing a lot of this in the field. And so, you know, there's a lot of people out here, there's familiar faces in the audience. You can come and talk to me. People tell me I never should put my email at the end of talks, so I always do, which generally doesn't go well for me. But there's a lot of people here with knowledge. Tanya, Millen, me, Steve's here. You know, there's a lot of people that you can come and talk to about what's going on in this space and how people from the computer sciences can really help out. Because I really do think that to really leverage the architecture of the information age to counter the Anthropocene, it's going to require a pretty strong synergy between conservation NGOs and the practitioners of the world, academia, and corporate partnerships. And so I represent one side of that. Many of you represent one or two of the others. And so hopefully over the next couple days we can have some interesting conversations about how to take some of this forward. Yeah?
So we have time for some questions.
So I really love the overview. Can you just say a couple of things about what you actually do yourself?
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So, so I lead an overall research program in Microsoft on everything from statistical modeling of extinction rates, things like that, to a lot of hardware projects recently. So for 3 to 4 years so I was in the Cambridge UK lab, and we had built a new platform for GPS tracking of wildlife, and really what we were interested in there called Mataki, and you can go check it out. It's an open source design and firmware. And what we really wanted to do there was say, okay, well, one of the things that's holding people back in the wildlife tracking business is it's a niche market and the prices are high and things like that. So can we use some of our R&D expertise to go in and drastically lower the price and the size and the weight of these things? So we came out with a really small, lightweight, and super cheap device. A lot of organizations are building their own now. We don't actually build them, but we offer those designs out. They go out and do it. We're taking that work one step further now, where we said, well, that was great, but we didn't do anything to reduce the biggest problem with GPS tracking, which is power. Right? So if you deploy a device on an animal, it can't go plug itself back in, so it can't really track itself all that frequently. So we're working on something called cloud offloaded GPS, which is kind of orders of magnitude power improvement of GPS tracking. So I keep saying this, and I haven't proven it yet. So I think if I just keep saying it, I'll force myself to do it. But we should be able to allow something like, you know, sub-second tracking of location for 2 years on 2 AA batteries. So those are the sorts of things that, and of course we're Microsoft, so we have other reasons for doing these things as well. But I'm motivated by the conservation of biodiversity, and so I wake up every day and work on these techniques because of that, and Microsoft maybe has a different motivation. But we put those things out into the conservation space for free.
Other questions? Okay, I have one. Yes. So you talked about Microsoft having other motivations. We were having a discussion yesterday about people who are engaged in this type of research. I mean, what interest does Microsoft have in the space? How big is the program? People who have got PhDs, let's say, in this area, could they look to Microsoft research?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say that companies, I can only speak for Microsoft Research, but I think this is often true, which is that, you know, Microsoft Research didn't hire me because I was a conservation biologist. They hired me because I was really interested at working at the intersection of all the things they're interested in, right? Bayesian hierarchical modeling, simulation, hardware and software, all of that. Cloud computing, big data. And I am motivated to get up and work really hard, harder than they pay me for, because I'm motivated by a particular applied topic. And I only see that growing in the computing industry. That when that if you have a topic and a passion and a motivation to apply the computational skills that you have, those jobs are just opening up faster and faster and faster. Now, whether or not growing a large team within a technology industry solely focused on conservation or solely focused on poverty alleviation or one of the other sustainable development goals, I think that's always going to be a bit of a sidetrack. But my email is up there. I'm more than welcome to. I spend a large part of most days talking to people about how they can kind of get out there and get doing what they're passionate about while also being gainfully employed. So please do contact me, and I can. I'm around as well during this week. So.
Any other final questions?
In terms of the collaborative space for developing novel environmental sensing, ecological sensing technologies, that's one area I'm quite interested in. Where do you see some of the most interesting exchange points where there's been real synergy with people picking up designs, putting new iterations, republishing? Where do you see your GPS concept?
Yeah, I think I actually wouldn't say the GPS concept is the greatest example because there's still such a gap between skills and resources required to take an open source hardware and firmware design, send it off, right, to some engineering firm, get it back. You still need to know a lot, actually. It's not off the shelf kind of technology. I think things like I-Naturalist and eBird are really great examples where people take some sort of easy consumer technology, start adding on top of it, publishing their own APIs, and then people are using that to build their own services. There's various governments that are using the I-Naturalist platform to build something completely different, their own biodiversity observation networks and things like that. I will say that this has been a bit of a tortured space for a while, and the reason I'm excited now is because I feel like things are starting to smooth out a little bit. There's been a lot of competition from a branding or a PR perspective within the nonprofits and the corporate world, and there hasn't been as much collaboration as there could have been. And over the last year, I've just really seen this stuff take off, and it's been great. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Lucas did a great job of saying, okay, we have a lot of problems. The way we solve problems is to make better decisions. So I'm all about making better decisions. The problem with making better decisions is we have to deal with a lot of uncertainties. So I'm going to mainly focus more on an energy side of the equation, but the broader theme here will be dealing with making decisions under uncertainty. So I'm going to start off with a little overview of some of the different types of uncertainties we run into with energy. For example, we're trying to build portfolios. Now when you look at this portfolio, you see familiar technologies. However, look at these again and you'll see nuclear energy that you have to plan a year in advance, coal and steam generation has to be planned a day in advance, gas turbines have to be planned an hour in advance, batteries that can be done totally real time, but sometimes you have to think minutes to hours into the future. We heard a lot about renewables. This is wind energy, a familiar map. Wind doesn't blow uniformly everywhere, which is a major problem. In the United States, it's mainly up and down the Midwest. When you actually take a look at energy generated, these are the wind farms, about 5 gigawatts of capacity from one of the big power grids of PJM that serves the Mid-Atlantic states. You see a lot of variability. You'll see a predictable seasonal pattern. Wind tends to drop in the summertime. But when you look at it on a finer time scale, you see very high variability. It's going from as much as 5,000 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts in a matter of hours. Okay, so this is a large variability. Here's our ability to forecast. This is the actual set of forecast provided by a German vendor to PJM. The black line is the actual. This blue line is the forecast starting at midnight. And with each passing hour, the forecasts are updated, and you can see the forecasts aren't very good. So this is what we refer to with uncertainty. That is, when we try to forecast something and we can't and it changes, this is